Hello and welcome. Russian forces are breaking through several positions along the Ukrainian defense. This and more in this situation report. Putin declared a 36-hour ceasefire between the 6th and the 7th of January in accordance to the Orthodox Christmas celebrations. He demanded Ukraine to participate in that for humanitarian reasons, while Russia itself was firing cruise missiles and using suicide drones against Ukraine on the 25th of December, when the majority of the Ukrainians are celebrating Christmas. It was probably meant, the ceasefire offer, to the domestic audience, presenting him as a protector of Orthodox Christianity. We have we have comments in this regard too from Chechen units, which are Muslim, that were praising him as like a real Christian in this regard, especially as Jesus is a prophet, is considered to be a prophet within Islam. Wagner apparently didn't adhere to that ceasefire from the Russian side, though, and used that called ceasefire maybe to surprise the Ukrainians, but they attacked themselves. But about this later, more in the video. The speaker for the GUR, the Ukrainian Military Intelligence, Vadim Skibitsky, said Russia so far has used 660 Shahed 131 and Shahed 136 drones. In total, they have ordered 1,750 from Iran, and the deliveries are coming in batches of 200 to 300 apiece. If the Russians are continuing to use the drones in the current ratio, they would probably run out in April to May. So we can expect Iran and Russia to negotiate further weapon sales until then. We all discussed in the past here, and it was on the channel in the past, that Iran supposedly is preparing the delivery of ballistic missiles to Russia, to allow Russia to use more ballistic missiles against Ukraine, as its own stocks on Tochka-U and Iskander have run low or run out. Russia itself is sending new troops and equipment to Belarus. There is video evidence of armored vehicles arriving in Belarus, but as of now, we cannot say that there has been an attempt. Let me just see real quick. That as of now, we don't see an attempt by any offensive positioning by the Russian forces inside of Belarus. So any potential attack seems still to out of Belarus into Ukraine. A second ground offensive seems to be rather far off. There is no sign of them preparing for that yet, and the troop strength is nowhere close for it to be strong enough for this. The next days, the temperature will drop to -15 to -10 to -15 degrees Celsius along the whole northern front line. This is 10 to 15 degrees below zero for those Fahrenheit using friends here. This should endanger soldiers that aren't properly protected additionally than in the past, and it would harden the ground, especially in areas where there has still been thawing weather recently. So it at least gives either side the opportunity to use more mobile units. It gives them more mobility, the potential for more mobility, but obviously they first have to penetrate their opponent's defenses. North of the Siversky Donetsk, the area here, there's actually not that much to report. The Ukrainian side is reporting continuous attacks by the Russians with a lot of different places. They are reporting attacks and fighting. The Russians themselves also report a lot of fighting. A Schwerpunkt for the Ukrainians seems to be the forest south of Crimea, which is obviously mostly close fighting between infantry groups. But in total, there is no indication that there has been any serious change in the position of territory within the last week or so. Further south of the Siversky Donetsk, it's somewhat different though. The week started with an interview from Yevgeny Prigozhin with RIA Novosti, where he he said like the Ukrainians have 500 defensive lines around Bakhmut, and even for single houses, often the fighting is lasting for days or even weeks. Since then, though, while he kept the hopes low at the beginning of the weeks, the Russians have achieved several breakthroughs through the Ukrainian defensive line, which in comparison to past advances over the last few months were fairly big, even though we will talk about the overall significance later in that situation report. As of now, it's clear that Bakhmutske, which is here, is now fully conquered by the Russians. That much is sure. The Russians also entered Soledar further north, but there was a counterattack, supposedly at least a counterattack over the last in the last night, so last 24 hours by the Ukrainians, and there is image evidence that the Ukrainians are at the salt mine, which is supposedly fairly south in the town, so they control the majority of the built-up area, while the Russians have bypassed Soledar in the north and the south to a certain degree. There were further reports that by the Russians from Russian military bloggers that they have reached the outskirts of Krasnopolivka, which would be here, and that would be fairly significant as it would obviously threaten the lines of supply, the lines of communication to Soledar even more than already, and it would be one of the main roads north in the direction of Siversk and in extension to Bilohorivka. So should this advance actually have materialized, that would be a much bigger threat for the Ukrainians than it already is. Further south, we have image proof of fighting in Pitorodne. The Russians have definitely entered it, so they advanced a couple of kilometers. What is it? More or less like 3 kilometers, more or less, further northwest. There's also a video of Ukrainian soldiers withdrawing from Pitorodne. It's impossible for me to say whether that's like the vanguard. No, is vanguard at front or in the end? I forgot. Whether those are the last Ukrainians that left Pitorodne. It didn't look though. They didn't look like they were under fire. I can't really read it as no, vanguard is in the front, right? I can't really read this as an indication that the whole of Pitorodne is given up, or is conquered by the Russians. But there seems to be troop movement out of Pitorodne by the Ukrainians. So Pitorodne is at the very least contested as of now, if not conquered by the Russian armed forces. In the past, there have been reports that at the beginning of the week that 2 battalion tactical groups of the VDV, that's the Russian air mobile forces, were moved to Popasna to help with the attacks on Soledar. Popasna is here. So it seems like the arrival of those units might have made the difference that allowed the Russian forces to advance further west in this regard. South of Bakhmut itself, the Russians supposedly have fully conquered Opytne, and there are indications that they managed to advance further west here from Kurdiumivka, further west into the hills there, but that is all in the region here when it comes to breakthroughs. Now, the importance of this has to be put into some perspective. The road that is passing through Soledar is very important for the supply of Siversk, for the communication with Siversk and in extension Bilohorivka, so basically the whole northern part of the front line south of the Siversky Donetsk, which is going here. It's not exclusively the only road that's going. Like by zooming in into the maps, you can easily see that there are lots of roads, like for instance this one coming here, but obviously every road that is cut is reducing the options for the Ukrainians to supply, and at the same time it's reducing the shortness of the distance. So until Soledar was contested, the Ukrainian and Pitorodne, the Ukrainian reinforcements, Ukrainian reserves could fairly easily switch between Siversk and Bakhmut by more or less going a direct line, with the road in between now being cut, with the lines of communications in between now being cut. That means they have to take detours and thus will be slower in reacting, which could allow Russian advances in the past. Also, it will obviously strain the Ukrainian supply lines further, as this for the same amount of supply to reach certain points, the trucks have to drive longer, and thus the overall throughput of supply is at least possible for it to go down. This does not mean that that Bakhmut is about to fall or it's about to be taken. Soledar is obviously in some danger of being surrounded, depending on the defensive positions here, of which I can't say too much. We can expect the Ukrainians to recognize this if the situation is close to what is shown here on the map, that the Ukrainians will either force counterattacks in other positions, try to drive the Russian flanks back, or that they will withdraw. Bakhmut itself can still be fairly solidly supplied from the west directly, so advances in the south and in the north are not the disaster that it might be, but it's obviously reducing the options for supply. It's making it easier for the Russians to shell supply routes. It might reduce the throughput. It might lengthen the time that reserves need to deploy, etc. If this area here falls, obviously this means that the whole northern area up to Bilohorivka will be harder to supply. So it might lead to the Ukrainians pulling back their forces somewhat to straighten their line. But this is too early to say whether this is actually going to happen anytime soon. But at least we should consider the option that the Ukrainians might more or less go back to a line close to Siversk fairly soon, which would then, on the other hand, weaken their options when it comes to a strike in the direction of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk after a potential capture of Crimea. And the stream technician is appearing. I hope he's not going to sabotage too much. No, he does seem to want to pass. Okay. Further south, we have further attacks around Avdiivka and around in Marinka. So attacks are happening here and in Marinka. But in total, especially in comparison to the Russian advances around Bakhmut, I cannot confirm any serious change in the possession of territory in these regions. The big news of the last week was the attack on Makivka. There was a HIMARS strike on a Russian base that was situated in a school. The number of losses is significant in this case. The Russians themselves admitted by now that they lost 89 soldiers. At least that's the last number I found. So it should be expected that there were even more in it. Supposedly that big school building was used by several hundred. There's some estimations of over 1,000 mobilized personnel being in that one building complex. And while it seems to have been hit by 6 HIMARS missiles, they also not just used it to house troops, which might have been having like a New Year's celebration or something like this, but it was actually used to store fuel and to store ammunition, which then was ignited and blown up by the HIMARS strikes. The number of actual losses we are not able to determine in any seriousness. The thing is, the complex is fairly big, and it was basically turned into rubble in its entirety. That should indicate massive losses, and with the Russians admitting 89 men, the Ukrainian estimates might be closer to the truth, and there you read numbers between 400 and even 800 persons, whereas in this total there it would mean the total number of casualties, so including wounded. So it's fairly likely that the Russians lost several hundred men in this one attack, where the Russians, in their usual way from what we know in the past, whenever they are getting defeated in a certain point, they usually blame local soldiers, then overall lack of capability or overall faults. In this regard, first with the military bloggers and then later the Russian military officials themselves were claiming that the losses occurred because the mobilized personnel was using their cell phones over the New Year's, and the Ukrainian side was able to locate them through this. It seems highly unlikely that cell phones were actually used for this, as the building is inside a heavily populated area, and thus the risk of just striking something there with a more or less accurate cell phone location, it seems fairly unlikely. Local interviews with local persons have said that supposedly the soldiers were there already for 2 weeks and that their commanding officer was looking for alternatives to house them. So maybe he saw the seriousness of the situation, but that those 2 weeks would have obviously given the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian partisans, maybe even special forces, enough time to relay the information of their troop concentration to the Ukrainian armed forces, which then struck the complex with HIMARS missiles. Pushilin, the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, was saying that the officers themselves have been mobilized. That is not really a set. So in an extent to say that the personnel was not well trained, but that in itself isn't really satisfying, because the even if they were freshly mobilized, it's fairly unlikely that the Russian just promoted somebody to commanding officer of a battalion without him having any commanding experience in the past. So that should have been retired uh, retired officers from the Russian armed forces, who then should know that a troop concentration like this within the artillery range of your opponent is nothing that you actually should do. So this is a sign of further Russian incompetence here. Of further Russian disciplinary problems, because the other thing is, even if cell phones were aiding the Ukrainian side in this whole thing, it's the job of the NCOs and the officers to stop soldiers using their cell phones en masse. All of this is a disaster for the Russian armed forces, and not just because of the loss of life, but also in what it implicates, the gross incompetence that was demonstrated by the Russian armed forces in this regard. The speaker of the Eastern forces of the Ukrainian armed forces, Colonel Serhiy Cherevati, said on the 2nd of January that the Russians in the past were using 20 to 80,000 grenades along the eastern front line here, and now it has shrunk to 20,000 a day at most. And according to him, the Russians are now frantically looking for 122 and 152 millimeter grenades in their own depots, as well as they are trying to buy them internationally. So the comments that the Russians are running out of artillery ammunition are continuing from the Ukrainian side, but obviously 20,000 shells a day is something that the Ukrainians could just dream of at this phase. So we will have to see how much of that actually holds true over time. Just because it's repeated a couple of times doesn't necessarily mean it's actually true, and the supply situation might be far less grave than the numbers that the Russians, than the quotes that the Russians run out of artillery shells actually would imply. Along the southern front, we have Russian military bloggers claiming further successes here in Doroshnyanka. One military blogger was even claiming the Russians have advanced up to Mirne. I don't see any proof of this whatsoever. I can't even confirm that Doroshnyanka has actually fallen to the Russian armed forces, but there are reports about Russian small-scale offensive activities along the Zaporizhia front, so it is well within the realm of possibility. Ukraine itself is reporting along the Dnipro activity by the Russians, continuous and repeating attempts by Russian forces to cross the Dnipro into liberated territory. This is most likely special forces for sabotage, for assassination, for intel gathering, and sabotage troops, more or less, in this regard, that are being fought here and identified, and then where the Ukrainian side is trying to destroy them. And we can obviously expect the Ukrainian side to more or less try the same at the same time. There's also reports about continuous combat on the islands in the Dnipro, especially Potemkin Island is supposedly one of the focus points of the fighting, and this is, if I understood it correctly, this island here that is being fought over by both sides. There are reports that the Russians are currently there and are shooting on the Ukrainian held side. Other reports claim that the Ukrainians have now conquered it. In the past weeks, we had reports about fighting on the islands in between, and I guess we can expect both sides to continue skirmishes, at the very least skirmishes, if not battles about those islands, even though in the overall strategic picture, it's worth discussing whether that's anything that is close to being a game changer. I don't really see it this way, but maybe I missed something. Yeah. Further south, the Russian military bloggers are talking, or south, it's actually west of it. Russian military bloggers are talking about recon advances on the Kinben Spit by the Ukrainians. So, according to Russian military bloggers, the Ukrainians are still active on the Kinben Spit, or at the very least trying to stay active on the Kinben Spit. But despite some Twitter channels claiming tremendous successes in Ukraine, not for the first time. As of now, we don't have any proof of any Ukrainian activity over this degree, about some shelling, about some fighting. There is no indication whatsoever that any town on the Kinben Spit has ever been liberated since the Russians occupied it. There are also reports now along the whole southern line, more or less, that I could summarize with like Marinka, Makivka, like Makivka. So I've had several reports from the Ukrainian side about HIMARS strikes that kill 400, that kill 200, that wound 800, like huge numbers being presented to us by the Ukrainians. In this regard, though, I have no proof whatsoever. There is no indication, and especially there is no confirmation from the Russian side. That doesn't mean it's needed to have confirmation by the Russian side, but as I said before, the Russians usually don't admit losses like this to a bigger degree. That they confirmed significant losses here, and with the outrage on the Russian military blogosphere about that attack on Marinka, makes it highly likely that it not just happened, but that it was far more devastating than the Russians officially admitted. Whether those other strikes by the Ukrainians actually took place and caused more loss of life for the Russians, I simply cannot confirm. So I'm not going to state single names about towns for just to repeat what the Ukrainians claim without any proof. There's also reporting now that the Russians are shelling Kherson city by now, several times a day. So what happened right after the liberation, that there seemed to be, for whatever reason, some kind of hesitation on the Russian side to shell the city itself, even though that would have been what I expected at that point. This hesitation, this self-restriction, this whatever cost this is over now. Russia is now shelling the city several times a day, and obviously with artillery, and not aimed at military targets directly, but causing havoc within the city and causing civilian losses. The GUR, that's again the Ukrainian military intelligence, is also saying the Russians are bringing reinforcements to Northern Crimea. They are getting reserves there. That's my interpretation, that they are concentrating reserves here for potential Ukrainian counterattacks. As I said in the past, stationing strong troops along the river here doesn't make too much sense, because you just expose them to artillery fire, as any serious advance over the river by the Ukrainians would be a present to the Russians, as it would be extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to keep those troops supplied, and thus they would probably deliver them to their end, deliver them to their doom, should they cross the river at a phase comparable to today's. So leaving anything close here doesn't make too much sense. And if you pull back your reserves, you need to keep them outside of HIMARS range, which is Northern Crimea. And at the same time, if it's somewhat in that area here, the distances to help against a potential Ukrainian counterattack south towards the Azov Sea will be more or less the same distance as in the case that they should actually be used along the Nippo. So the Ukrainian side are talking that the Russians are building up reserves here, and that shouldn't be much of a surprise, as obviously keeping the land bridge intact is of immense importance to the Russian side to keep their whole troop concentration here along the Dnipro, but as well as on the Crimea supplied. From the Crimea itself, over the last few days, there were repeating reports about air defense system activating and shooting at something. So there seems to be a continuous drone activity by the Ukrainians over the Crimean Peninsula. We don't have any confirms, though, that those drones actually hit something on the ground. So the Russians shot at something, likely at Ukrainian drones, but those drones, whether they were recon or whether they were on strike missions, I cannot confirm at this point. When it comes about the mobilization, we have some interesting news here. That is about the Russian central bank. According to it, or according to this report, they actually said that the central bank has ordered all its offices to hand mobilization call-up cards to everyone who's a debtor. So if you have debt with the Russian central bank, you might, instead of being asked to pay it back, you might receive a mobilization letter, which is reported, but doesn't make complete sense to me. But that's yeah, I said it's reported at several points why especially debtors should be called up, and while the central bank would call its own stations to do that, doesn't make too much sense to me. Prigozhin has produced a video where he was handing over medals to Wagner fighters, and at the same time he was giving them paperwork that would show their exoneration. No, is it exoneration? Like when they're not just commutation, their pardon. That was the word I was looking for. The letters for their pardons. This is obviously has to be seen within the context of both the information sphere as well as propaganda, because he was giving them their pardons for fighting for 6 months, so they fulfilled their contract. That would mean that the 40,000 prior convicts or current convicts, no matter what you want to call them, that are currently fighting within Wagner would be presented like with proof that if they actually continue fighting for 6 months, that they will receive their pardons and thus will exonerate themselves, will get a way out of the system in this regard. And at the same time, he's presenting himself in a honorable way, keeping his word, achieving things, etc. And this is especially important too in the context as he had a New Year's speech that was called by some military bloggers far more important and better than the one that Putin himself said. So Prigozhin was like appearing again, like he is at least subtly presenting himself as an alternative. Uh, the Speaker of the US National Council, and this is in context with this, John Kirby, said recently that Wagner has 50,000 men in Ukraine, but 40,000 of those are convicts. So in this regard, you can see to what degree Russia is mobilizing convicts to fight for them, to what degree, obviously, the presentation of a video of actual pardons being handed out is important, as those men are being used in massive attacks against the Ukrainian positions, especially around Bakhmut, which is then which would then give us an indication while the Russians are keep advancing in the region, as they have a massive manpower pool that can be expended in a concentrated area of just a few kilometers, more or less, between, where is it? More or less on between 20 to 30 kilometers, depending on the focus here. No, I think it was further south too. Yeah, like more or less along a 30, 35, maybe 40-kilometer range. They can use 50,000 men, and 40,000 of those are convicts. The other 10,000 supposedly are reserves that being held back are elite troops, where some rumors were that they were being prepared for being used inside of Russia, but that's a whole different topic. But that shows us the massive amount of troops that Wagner is pushing in there to advance further in this regard. And from Ukraine, we have more reports that they expect a Russian second mobilization wave that is about to be imminent. So we heard in the past that I think they said it's either the 5th or the 9th of January where they expected it. Obviously, the 5th was 2 days ago. The 9th would be on Monday, so we will see whether the Ukrainians have been right, but we should not be surprised with a second mobilization wave. And the Ukrainian GRU expects not just to have a second mobilization wave, but that it would coincide with an extension of martial law and with a closing of the international borders of Russia for military-aged men, to make sure that not even more men are trying to avoid fighting for the Russian side in this war. When it comes to the political sphere, Putin, in his New Year's speech, was thanking the Russian people for their efforts to help Ukrainian children go on vacation within Russia, which is more or less a confirmation by Putin himself for the transfer of Ukrainian children into the Russian Federation. And he ordered the appropriate institutions inside of Russia to put up more effort to identify orphans within Ukraine, then obviously again with where we can assume that he will send them to Russia to be adopted by Russian parents and thus Russifying Ukrainian children. Ukraine itself reported that in the liberated areas west of the Dnipro, so on the right bank of the Dnipro, they have discovered more torture chambers both in Kherson city as well as in areas within the oblast of Mykolaiv that were used by the Russians against Ukrainian soldiers, policemen, and civilians. And finally, we have some news about international support, and there obviously this week has meant a lot of improved aid for Ukraine. From the US now, the latest news is 50 Bradley. Those should be Bradley M2A2. So not the most modern version, but still a version that is more or less more modern than almost everything that the Russians on their side has better optics, better command and control, etc. Also 100 M113, 55 MRAPs, 138 Humvees, 18 M109, that's self-propelled artillery, 70,000 155 millimeter shells, 500 precision guided shells that should be Excalibur, also for the 155. There's also a report that they are going to deliver 36 155 drawn artillery pieces that should be M777, even though I didn't read it in confirmation, but I don't think they have any older versions still in reserve. I might be wrong there. Also interesting that the US are delivering 1200 155 millimeter RAAM. That's remote anti-armor mine systems. That's an artillery shell that can be used shot into the enemy's rear, where it displaces 9 anti-tank mines that supposedly blow themselves up after 24 hours. So for instance, in coordination with an own attack, you could use those shells to mine the routes of the enemy, where likely enemy reinforcements will arrive and thus blow itself up by a minefield within their own hinterland where they don't expect mines to be. So a very potent system if used under the right circumstances. And there are rumors that Poland wants to hand over all of their 240 Leopard 2 to Ukraine. I don't see any of this as close to confirmation, especially as there were reports recently about further Polish attempts to or intentions to modernize their Leopard 2A4 to the Leopard 2 PL version. But supposedly the prime minister of Poland is also involving himself now, and they are more or less discussing it now. The issue there is, though, it's highly likely that Poland will only hand over those tanks if they get immediate replacements. So that would mean Abrams tanks from the US. The US would have to supply them with Abrams, so Poland doesn't have a gap in their armor capability. And the big issue will be that any handing over of Leopard 2s will require the confirmation by the German government and the permission by the German government, which as of now has no intention to deliver main battle tanks, even though Germany this week has finally confirmed the delivery of 40 Marder IFVs. And finally, to end it up, we have one interesting picture here where we can see bombs being transported by the Russian train system, and it shows us two interesting things. First of all, we don't see any pallets, we don't see any transportation in a more efficient way that we would expect from Western systems. But the other interesting part is that those are freight wagons meant like for coal or iron ore or something like this, and the Russians are using this. On my channel, I said probably 4 weeks into the war or something that I read an article that Russia switched its wheeled its train system from one system to the other. I can't remember which one was, but the one was far more sophisticated and more efficient and better, but Russia is not able to produce them themselves, but they have to buy them in the West, and the West is no longer delivering them. I think it was Kamil Galeev who said that this will mean that the Russian train system should collapse within a reasonable time frame. Maybe this is actually an indication of this already being already happening, because it doesn't make sense to use those trains in a country like Russia that has a potent and big train fleet, which is completely reliant on its trains, that they are now being forced to use those unless their train system is already collapsing. That was it for me for now. I hope it was interesting for you. If it was interesting for you, this channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description, but it's also support, obviously, if you like the video and hit the thumbs up button. If you leave some comments, what do you think about the current situation? Will the Russian be able to advance further, will their mobilization, the second wave of this mobilization, turn the war completely to their side back to their site? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and recommend the channel to friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.